Up. Um, all right, so happy Cyber Threat Thursday, our first fall winter series, our webinar series. This is something that we're going to be doing the first Thursday of every month. I'm sure that it will grow and change. This Thursday, we have 3 of our partners on the line. We're happy to have Varonis kicking us off. And then at 10 a.m., we're going to be having Carbon Black, and at 11 o'clock, we're going to be having Netscope. But to start us off, we're happy to have our partner Varonis here. Again, like I said, this webinar series is going to basically grow and change. This week, we have 3 straightforward introductions with our partners. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have. This will also be recorded, so if anybody needs a recording of that. Also, feel free, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, to get in touch with me there. We can have you signed up for the newsletter. You can hear more about events that we're having here at Atlantic Data Security as we grow and as we rebrand. It's an exciting time for us over here at Atlantic Data Security. So we're very excited to start our first Cyber Threat Thursday. I screamed to my son this morning that it was Cyber Threat Thursday. He wasn't that thrilled. But anyway, we're happy to have Matthew on the line. And Matthew, I'm going to totally butcher your name. What is it, Radulek?
Yeah, you got it. Just like Cadillac.
Oh, Radulek. And we're happy to have you kicking us off this morning. I appreciate it. And again, we'll have time at the end for questions or anything, or if you'd like during the webinar, you can chat and send us a question, and we'll stop when we see the question and basically catch up with you then. So with that, I will click here and promote you so that we'll share his screen. Thank you, Matthew, for being here. I appreciate it.
As soon as I've got this all set up, I'll be able to share out my screen. So just give me 1 second.
If I die during this presentation, don't take offense to it. It's because I just drank a week-old coffee that was sitting at my desk by mistake. Let me know if you have any problems. There you go.
And can you guys see my presentation right now?
Yep.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name is Matt Radulek. I head up security architecture and incident response at Varonis. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Varonis at a high level, and then we're going to get very specifically into the threat detection, incident response, and forensics capabilities in the platforms. So the title of this presentation is How Attacks Work and How Varonis Helps. And just to break the ice a little bit, I like to start my presentations with a short story. So I'm just going to ask the audience here, a theoretical question, which is, what do you think that we can learn about cybersecurity from sea turtles? And I'll give you guys a hint. It's not to have a hard shell and a soft GUI inside. And a lot of times when I ask this question, I get a variety of answers about, like hiding in the rocks or staying in the shadows. But the answer that I'm looking for is actually how sea turtles reproduce. What those mama sea turtles do when they lay their eggs is they bury them on the shores of the beaches. And when those eggs hatch, those baby sea turtles, they follow the brightest light in the sky in order to journey to safety. And oftentimes the brightest light in the sky is the moon, or it's the stars in the sky. And that when they follow that bright light, they follow that light into the ocean. But unfortunately, what's happening today is those baby sea turtles, they're not following the brightest light in the sky. They're not seeing the moon anymore. They're getting crowded by those polluted city lights or the lights on the highways or some kind of street lights. And so they're walking into these cities and meeting an unfortunate end. And Varonis, we really feel like the same thing is happening in the cybersecurity space, because we feel like companies have their eyes focused, they have their laser vision focused somewhere other than on their data. Maybe they're focused on their network, or their endpoints, or maybe they're just focused on some sort of insider activity or a compliance driven initiative. But what they're not doing is focusing on their data. And what our vision is we want you to know where your sensitive data is, even help you define that sensitive data. Is it PCI information? Is it GDPR information, HIPAA information? Maybe there's some internal company information that you want to protect with an extra high level degree of protection and assurance. Then you want to make sure that only the right people have access to that information. So who are the right people? Is it the people that have been using the data? Is it a particular department? The other thing, and that's the big focus for the presentation today, is we want to identify different cyber threats and detect those threats and stop those threats and even respond to those threats and investigate those threats. And all while we're doing that, we want to leverage automation to sustain all that hard work that we just did, whether it was in privilege management or in threat detection. We want to make sure we're leveraging automation in order to keep that secure state the way it is. So we do that with a platform. And again, this is probably the only high-level overview slide I'm going to do for the presentation today, and then we'll get very into the threat detection capabilities in the platform. I just thought it would be good for the audience to have a general overview of Varonis. So we play in the unstructured data space. It's in your Windows, Office 365, Exchange, your Unix and Linux data repositories, your SharePoint sites, and your NAS arrays like NetApp and Isilon, and a lot of other different NAS arrays are supported. We're also inside of Active Directory and able to pull in all your telemetry from the perimeter, like your VPN, your proxy, and your DNS. And we pull all this information. What we're specifically collecting are 5 different streams of metadata. So that's your users and groups. So those are like every single user inside of Active Directory and their group memberships. And we do that so when we see permission entries, whether those are direct permission entries on users or their groups on permissions entries, we know who they are and who the users that belong to that permissions entry are. We tie that in with the actual access activity. So all the open events, the modify events, the create events, the delete events, the access denied events across all those different unstructured repositories. We're correlating that with the perimeter telemetry. So for instance, like your VPN connections, or anytime that you're going to upload or download data from a website or make a DNS query, and marrying that with the content classification. So for instance, we'll know if someone accesses GDPR data in a weird way and then uploads a weird amount of data to a website. And we drive from that 3 major use cases for the platform. The first one really being those compliance and governance driven use cases, usually associated with data access governance, is the space that a lot of people call it. The second one is risk reduction associated with open access. So a lot of companies that Varonis goes to work with, when we go in for the first time, the everyone group or the domain users group or the authenticated users group, they've got access to a lot of information, sometimes over 50% of all the data inside of a network being exposed to everyone. And we're going to help companies flip that switch. That's a really core capability to the platform. But the third one, and the one that I love talking about the most, the one that has to do the most with my role at Varonis, is those threat detection, incident response, and forensics capabilities. And that's what this presentation is all about today. I'm going to take a deep dive into what a typical attack scenario would look like and how that would look inside of Varonis. So, I'm sure you guys have heard of the kill chain before, so this will just be a review for you. But how do typical cyber attacks work? Well, in the first phase of an attack, those attackers are going to get into your network, right? And the way that they're doing it through things like phishing attacks or drive-by downloads on malware, like when they do a strategic web compromise and host some vulnerable code on an ad on a website. What we're seeing from an incident response standpoint at Varonis is actually a lot of companies are under brute force attack, and attackers are getting in that way. Once they get that foothold on side of your network, they're going to want to learn your systems and accounts. Some different techniques that they'll use here, loading up tools like Nmap, or even just using the existing user account to look around. The more sophisticated things that you'll see in the reconnaissance space would be something like reverse lookups inside of DNS. So instead of asking the DNS server, hey, I have this website like atlanticdatasecurity.com, I need to get an IP address so I can open a connection on it. They're saying, hey, I have this IP address. What is the host name behind this IP address? And they're going to move around and escalate their privileges, a lot of times taking advantage of the fact that Active Directory wasn't necessarily built with security in mind. So like outdated authentication protocols like RC4 are easy to reverse the hashes on those passwords, taking advantage of weaknesses in NTLM or Kerberos, doing things like pass the hash or pass the ticket. All of that is just so they can access more resources, access more devices, elevate their privileges possibly to domain admin. And once they do that, that's when they want to start to find the data that they're after. Whether that's GDPR information, corporate finance information. Sometimes attackers have no direct motivation. They're just after data in general. Sometimes they're after something very specific. And once they find that information, that's when they're going to want to take it out. And what that looks like inside of our platform is all the alerts come together in what we call our data alert dashboard. And so this is just one example of what's up on the screen, where you see the alerts that are happening over time and their severity. You have some information which we call facets on the right side of the screen, and the actual threat model name and the kill chain category that they match up to on the right. But rather than spending a lot of time here, I'm going to show you guys and break down every single threat model that gets triggered and what that would look like, right? So here's where an attack starts at the beginning, where that attacker is starting to see a possible credential stuffing attack. And that's a type of brute force attack where we start to see a lot of usernames and passwords start to be guessed. And then we actually see a successful brute force attack. So there was a series of failed login attempts followed by a successful login attempt. And that's where you really want to key in and say, okay, was this user account compromised? And from here, what we saw the attackers start to do is those different reverse lookups inside of DNS, where again, they ask that DNS server after figuring out their current IP address, right? Like they opened up a command prompt, they typed in ipconfig, they found out their IP address was 10.10.60.24, and they wanted to look around inside of that subnet. So they performed a lot of reverse lookup queries, and they asked that DNS server, well, what else is around me? And when you do that, you can find out information. A lot of companies, they name all of their computers the same way. Their exchange servers have EX in them. Their domain controllers have DC or DOM inside of the name. And that information is valuable to an attacker because they can know that that's the machines that they want to attack next. What happened next inside of Varonis is we saw an abnormal service behavior, right? So when we go out, we're going to go in and identify all the different user accounts inside of an environment. We're going to know what accounts are admin accounts, what accounts are service accounts, what accounts are executive accounts, what accounts are regular user accounts. And the specific anomaly that we caught here was there was an unusual amount of logons to personal devices. And so because if you guys remember earlier in the presentation, I told you about all the different metadata streams that Varonis collects. Because we collect those access events and we know the computers that users are using to access that information, we're going to map every computer inside of an environment that we know a user only uses as their personal device. So for instance, the laptop that I'm giving the presentation from today, Varonis knows is my personal device. And so it would be very odd if a service account inside of my organization started to access a lot of personal devices, because that would mean that all of a sudden a service account who doesn't normally access end users' computers is accessing information or is logging on to computers that we know belong to regular users like me or like you guys out here on the phone today. We also then see an unusual amount of devices accessed. And so this is where we learn the number of devices that a particular account logs into in a given time period. And we're going to alert you to the fact that an unusual number of devices have been accessed. And this follows that same attack story. Or what you would identify here are attackers that are beginning to move around, trying to escalate their privileges. They're trying to get access to more information. And in the next phase of attack, we start them to see the leverage that pass the ticket technique. So a lot of people are familiar with pass the hash, where attackers are going to harvest that hash password from memory, but attackers are also doing that same sort of attack with Kerberos, where instead of taking that full Kerberos authentication event where they authenticated to the authentication server, they got their ticket granting ticket, and then they got that resource ticket and tried to access that file system. What they're going to do is take an existing resource ticket from a computer and they're going to just replay that ticket. So they're going to skip over the whole part where they say, are you who you say you are? And they're just walking right up to that file server and saying, oh, I'm actually Matt Radulak. I'd like to access this data. And that file server says, oh, you've got a valid ticket. Here you go. Go ahead. In the next phase, this is where you actually see attackers start to stage the data that they would like to exfiltrate. And so what we've noticed is that The attackers have access to an unusual amount of idle and sensitive data. And so in the Varonis platform, the quantifications around data, we have stale data, which would be data that no one in an organization has touched. And then we'd have idle data, which would just be data that this one user hasn't touched. And so for me, data that, maybe you guys access every day, but I don't access, if we were on the same network, that data would be idle to me, though it would be active to you. And sensitive data means we recorded those classification results. So we have hundreds of out-of-the-box rules on classification, like some of those things that I mentioned earlier around PCI, GDPR, HIPAA information, Sarbanes-Oxley, patent information, finance-related information. Then we have an engine for you to be able to build your own rules and classify data according to your own classification policy. And the sensitive flags means that we've recorded those classification results against that data. So here we see an account that's starting to access an unusual amount of data that they've never touched, that they haven't touched recently, and that we've recorded classification results against it. And in that same light, we also saw a service account start to access mailboxes that it doesn't normally access. So again, here's a scenario where it might be normal for a service account to have access to different email inboxes, but why would a service account all of a sudden start to access mailboxes that it's never accessed before? These are all good signs of compromise. These are all good signs that something fishy might be going on. And if you weren't already convinced that something fishy was going on, by the time you get to the actual exfiltration events, this is where it might be a dead giveaway. And I've got to move my Zoom bar here, guys, because it is in the way. And so the first alert that we fired here was around abnormal behavior. An unusual amount of data was uploaded to an external website after accessing GDPR data. So what you see here is, since we know the classification of the content that the users access, we can say that we know when users are accessing GDPR information, which absolutely would help you become compliant with GDPR, but also alerting on when they're doing that in a weird way is a good way to identify if someone is misusing GDPR information. And so here, when you know how much data a user normally uploads to a website and how much GDPR data that they normally access, when you alert on this, you might be alerting on a user, again, whose account is compromised or who doesn't know that they shouldn't be uploading that GDPR information to a website. And they actually uploaded a large amount or an abnormal amount of data right after they accessed that GDPR information. The next alert is around an abnormal service behavior. So we saw where they uploaded data to external websites. And again, this gets back to, do you know if your service accounts are accessing the internet? Is that something that you want to use Varonis to leverage machine learning to identify for you? Do you want to know when a service account starts to upload data to the internet after it's never done that before? And then the last alert is back to one of those more sophisticated exfiltration techniques. And that's where we identified the attackers were leveraging DNS tunneling. And what is DNS tunneling? Well, that's when attackers, they take a file or a series of files and they break it up into thousands and thousands of little pieces. And then they exfiltrate them over DNS or disguised as DNS queries. So for instance, what you might see here is I could take a file, like even the presentation that I gave here to you guys today, and I could put that through a script to break that file up into 16-character hexadecimal chunks. And then instead of asking that DNS server, hey, what is the IP address of AtlanticDataSecurity.com, I'm actually going to ask it, what is the IP, what is the IP address of threat model abnormal access behavior : AtlanticDataSecurity.com. And that would actually be encoded on the other end, so it wouldn't be so obvious that I was taking a presentation out over DNS. And I'm going to do that over thousands and thousands and thousands of DNS queries. And then on the other end, on my attacker machine, I'm going to piece that file back together. And that's one way that we see from an IR standpoint, how we see attackers trying to exfiltrate data, as opposed to just doing things like emailing it out of an organization or uploading it to Dropbox, or maybe putting it on a USB stick if they've been successful at getting a physical compromise. And what we want to point out as well is, it's one thing to have a security platform and to get a lot of insightful alerts, especially when they're involving like looking at a user's behavior and identifying those behavioral anomalies. But it's another thing to really be empowered in order to analyze them quickly and take action on them. And every single alert from Varonis is packed full of insights or has a lot of context. And so what I'm going to do for you now is actually run through our context page or our insights page. And so what you'll see right off the bat is we know that this account is an administrator. We know that the account hasn't been changed recently, so none of those Active Directory properties has been modified. But John is working from an unexpected geolocation. And so we got that information because we see the source IP address of that VPN connection. We know where the user's coming in from when they're coming into the network remotely. And in this case, we're saying that John has never worked from this geolocation before. And this is just one good indicator that, again, this account might be compromised. They've also issued a geo-hopping alert. So what that means is that we've seen a login event from one place, like say New York City, where I'm doing this presentation. And then we saw a login from another place that is an unreasonable distance away in the amount of time frame that it's taken to generate that log event. So for instance, maybe North Korea, or maybe in Eastern Europe, we see a login event 5 or 10 minutes after you saw a login event in New York City, which just isn't physically possible. It's just not possible unless maybe, again, compromise or credential sharing has occurred. We also see that this is the first time use of this computer. And so we're looking at the source computer for all of the events that lead up to the generation of an alert. And we know that the computers that a user normally uses to access information or access devices, like that source IP address of all of those events. And so when we see a user start to behave weird from a computer that they've never accessed before, we're going to point that out here. We're also going to tell you whether or not that computer was involved in other alerts, because it may be an indicator that that device has been compromised by attackers. And so that insight is also right there inside the device page. And the insights that I'm walking you through, these are packed in every single alert, even in the alerts that you might define yourself. And so again, with the Varonis platform, you get a lot of pre-built threat models, over 120 out of the box models today, just like the ones that I just ran through with you, but also the ability to create your own models and identify your own threats, and they'll still get packed full of these same insights. There's also insights around the data, right? At the beginning of the presentation, I said, don't be like the sea turtles and lose sight of the brightest light in the sky. Remember to shine your lights on the data. Well, here's where you'll find out whether or not the data was used by this user in the last 90 days, whether or not this data was sensitive. Like I mentioned before, we recorded those classification results against it. We're also going to see whether or not the resources that were used, so like the file servers that we monitored, the platforms that we monitored, the SharePoint sites even, was this the first time that we've actually seen them use that entire resource, not just those specific files? And how about against her peers? Are her peers doing that same thing? And then the last area of insight is around time. So again, because we see all of those access events across all of those different data repositories, we build a profile of what's normal for a user in terms of working hours. Does a user normally start reading emails around 7:30 and stop around 9 p.m. at night? And this alert fired because they started to access and send and receive a bunch of emails at 2 o'clock in the morning? Or how about the same thing for just data access? Does a person normally access data from 9 to 5, and they've had an anomalistic amount of data that they've accessed, and it was at 3 o'clock in the morning or even at 10 o'clock at night? This is where you'd start to identify those things. And these are in addition to the fact that a threat model has triggered and an alert has fired, similar to those alerts that I ran through with you guys just a few minutes ago. And what we call these things are insights, and they've got all of that alert specific information inside of them. And again, it applies to any rule that is inside of the Data Alert platform, whether it's a customer defined rule or one of our pre-built threat models. And the other good thing is, this kind of a workflow, this kind of a forensics report that we ship with every single alert that we fire, it really integrates well into your SIEM workflow, because we've got certified integrations with all the major SIEMs, the Splunks, the QRadars, the Logarithms of the world, even ArcSight, if you're still using ArcSight, popular technology. What we're able to do is we're able to send our alerts directly to those SIEMs. And then what an analyst would do inside of the SIEM platform is they would click on the link to that Varonis alert, and they would get brought right to this page, this insights page, with their first click. And with their second click, they would actually get taken to see the raw events. And so getting into that raw event level of what happened, why did a threat model trigger, typically between that and the context page is anything that an analyst needs to make a decision about whether or not a compromise had occurred. And the other thing to think about is when you have events, when you have the ability to quickly search through all these events across all these different unstructured file repositories, you also have tremendous forensics capabilities. And so why I bring that up is because sometimes, you're not going to get all the alerts on everything in your environment just from one tool or one platform like Varonis. You may get an alert maybe from your antivirus. And Maybe you got it from your endpoint detection capabilities, like Carbon Black, who I believe might be presenting after me or later today. Maybe Carbon Black fired an alert and you need to do an investigation. Well, again, just with one click, you'd be able to start a new search on a user or start a new search on a device, and you'd be able to see all of the access events or the access denied events, the perimeter telemetry, all of those events from all of the different resources inside of your environment in just a few clicks. So for instance, maybe I just wanted to see all of the data that was touched by Matt Radulak in the last 10 days. Maybe I want to see all the data that was touched that's associated with his computer in the last 10 days because his computer fired an antivirus alert. Maybe by doing that, I'm actually going to see that 2 other user accounts have been accessing data from Matt's laptop. And that might be insightful to know that Matt's computer was compromised and the attackers are harvesting additional credentials and they're logging into Matt's computer and accessing data when Matt doesn't know it from his computer against that information. And so there's really tremendous forensics capabilities available by having all of these log events available to search and sortable as well. From here, I just wanted to briefly mention that, we have those certified integrations. We have those apps for QRadar. We also have a Varonis app for Splunk, which is going to give you that dashboard-like feel of our alerts inside of your SIEM. And what I also wanted to mention is, when you really sit down and look at the kill chain, what you want to do is identify where you have capabilities in terms of the kill chain today. Can you detect an attack no matter what stage of the attack that it's in? We all want to detect attackers early on in the kill chain. We want to find them when they're trying to break into the network, but it's important to be able to find them all throughout that. And to not forget about things like obfuscation, not to forget about things like denial of service attacks. Because from an IR standpoint, some of the more sophisticated things that we've seen, it's pretty novel when you think about it, is attackers will delete entire security stacks. So I've seen attackers delete security VMs or delete security VM hosts. I've seen them log in and stop processes on different machines. And so you want to have some detection capabilities in order to identify that your security layers themselves, the very things that are supposed to be protecting you, aren't being disabled by a third party. You want to make sure that you can identify those different kinds of exfiltration techniques, not just the ones that you might have a DLP to protect against, not just the ones that you might have reputational blocking at like an IPS or on a network device to be able to detect. You really need to look for the ways in users doing weird or anomalistic things in the way that they interact with the data. And so sit down, look at the kill chain, look at your detection capabilities that you have today, and try to see and identify if you have a gap. Because the data alert platform, everything that you went over in the presentation today, our goal is to provide you with threat models or threat detection capabilities at every phase of the kill chain. Is either to augment your existing capabilities or provide you with new threat detection capabilities, no matter what stage of an attack that an attacker might be in on your network. And so really what I wanted to end with before we open it up for questions is we offer a free service, a data risk and threat assessment to any company. And that's something you can do with us in Atlantic Data Security if you guys are interested. And what we're going to do during this assessment is do things like find some of the metrics that you see on the screen, right? So we're going to quantify the risk inside of your environment. How much sensitive data do I have? How much data do you have that's a known record type, like health information or personal information or European citizen information? How much of that is overexposed, or how much of that has too many people that have access to it? And then in parallel to that, are any of the threat models firing? Are we identifying insider threats? Like, for instance, an IT admin marking a bunch of messages as unread in an executive mailbox, or other additional threats such as behavioral anomalies. Like, is there a service account that's accessing a lot of personal devices, possibly meaning that an application engineer is logging in interactively and impersonating that service account? Are there any AD exploits going on, right? Is there a pass the ticket attack that might be occurring, or even a ticket harvesting attack? Like a ticket harvesting attack, by the way, is when attackers are harvesting all those Kerberos tickets that have those SPN names or those service names inside of them in an attempt to reverse those service names and log in as those customers. Or are there any exfiltration events going on? Is there DNS tunneling that's happening inside of your environment right now? A lot of these things and many more different threat models that could fire could be detected inside of our assessment. And so it's just a great way to get the conversation started with Varonis. It's a great way to sit down with us and say, hey, I'd like to know how I stack up against all your different data access governance use cases. I'd like you to come in and do that threat assessment. And again, let me know whether or not any of your threat models are triggering. And so with that, I just wanted to open it up for questions. I really enjoyed being able to present to you guys today a little bit about how we see attacks working and how we're able to detect and respond to those attacks.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, I'm trying to see if there's any questions here on the line. It doesn't look like there is at the moment. I think some of you are actually unmuted, so if you do have a question, feel free. Give just a minute or two for that.
Hi, it's Bruce. I have a question. Is there different modules in your system? Like, you know, if you come in and do the assessment, how many different systems would we have to deploy to have, you know, the visibility that you were just showing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bruce. So we are a modular-based platform. We monitor, we have modules for every major data repository. So like your Windows file shares or your NAS arrays, that's what we call our file system data advantage license. SharePoint and Exchange would be their own different modules as well. So it really depends on what you would hope to get out of that assessment. A lot of times, what we see customers typically do, like our typical data risk assessment, is going to include like monitoring your file shares, turning on classification, turning on all alerting, turning on the Active Directory monitoring, and then some customers will also turn on the perimeter monitoring as well. And so in that case, you'd get a lot of the threat models, right? If we didn't turn on Exchange or SharePoint, you might not get every single one of them, but you would get a lot of the threat models and have a pretty good exposure to Varonis at that standpoint.
And how is the product priced? Is it per module or?
Yeah, it's going to be per user per module, and really when you think about it that way, it's just better than having a whole enchilada price. We just try to align to specifically what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then sell you the capability to monitor that platform. We also have something we call our journey of value, which is how we help customers adapt modules over time, as opposed to buying them all up front. So bring on what you can bring on now, ramp up to speed, as opposed to saying from day one, let's monitor all the different repositories. Any other questions, Bruce?
No, I think that's it. I mean, I won't ask you what the prices are.
Yeah, that's absolutely something we can have as a follow-up. I actually personally don't know. I'm kind of detached.
We don't let engineers know that information.
Yeah, I'm detached from the sales process, but we'd be happy to get you in touch with someone that could help you with that.
Yeah, we'll definitely follow up with you, Bruce, and get you any information that you might need.
All right, thanks.
All right, I don't think that there's any other questions. And if anyone does have any questions, feel free to follow up with myself or with Matt. I appreciate your time, Matt. And anyone who can bring together enchiladas and sea turtles, in my opinion, is just amazing, especially this early in the morning.
Thank you.
Yes. So thanks again. I appreciate it. I hope to see you all at 10 o'clock for our next webinar, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.